I was always interdisciplinary by instinct, if not by training. And I came into even my undergraduate degree with a set of questions about the relationship between aesthetics and the political, or the potential of the poetic in relationship to political life. And so tried to do a double degree in political science and literature, and my very classical university at the time said there's no relationship between literature and politics, so you can't count any of your credits for one for the other, right? So this led to a certain amount of stubbornness on my behalf, and I went looking for a kind of space where training and interdisciplinarity might help me to think about the political elements of the culture and the cultural elements of politics. Under the kind of guise of politics is best not left to politicians, right? That kind of sense that there might be some potential for different forms of representational experimentation that might exceed reportage, the evidentiary, the documentary, the testimony, something like that. So my training is very eclectic. I did a master's in gender studies at the London School of Economics, a place where we really were invited to think a lot about not only thinking politically, but thinking for the political, right? But this is with people who are involved in NGOs, people who are involved in the kind of British think tank environment, but really about thinking about how one put into play, put into practice different forms of political ideas. From there, I then went to the University of California at Santa Cruz and did a doctorate in the history of consciousness department, which is really where finally I think I did get the training and interdisciplinarity that I was so craving. In a department where people did anything from 13th century mystics to bodily fluids to film to religious studies, right? So it's a really, a plethora of really different research projects, all in some way maybe committed to the legacy of Freud and Marx as these kind of foundational figures for thinking radically about contemporary social life. There I developed a project which became the subject of my first book, which was called Prismatic Media and Transnational Circuits, Feminism in Globalized Present. And really it was trying to think about the ways in which, given the human rights regime of the 1990s and feminist activism in the human rights regime in the 1990s, what other languages might there be for making visible sites of political struggle for feminists around the world? Because at the time, there was the idea of making women's rights visible. And that was very often accompanied by a kind of testimonial data gathering of people's testimonies about sexual violence, about cases of civil unrest, etc. And I was trying to think about what are the other languages, particularly given the incredible role that feminist art experimentation played in the 20th century in building artistic languages and avant-gardes. What role might different modes of aesthetic representation play in making claims for political rights? And particularly, I looked at the emergence of video in the 1970s as the key technology in and through which feminists represented the political. Why? Because it was a cheap medium compared to film. It was easily accessible. It was immediately recordable and viewable simultaneously. And you could do all kinds of interesting things within camera editing and display. And so I was saying there are certain technical affordances that video provided, as well as a certain way in which it was being mobilized that really challenged the evidentiary nature of the kind of documentary film or witness gathering or tape. And what I began to look at was specifically multi-channel video, where people would put up a number of different screens and make the screens talk to one another in ways that were complex and that related to very often what was the kind of double bind of visibility for feminists, which is that visibility also invites infringements of human rights, right? And the visibility invites a kind of objectification or a kind of exoticization. And so what I found among contemporary art practices, experimental documentaries, and feminist activism was a different way of representing the political that wasn't purely evidentiary. And I tried to call that prismatic media because it diffracted that kind of evidentiary relationship between the real and the representation into multiple different screens and forms of mediation. I went on to teach at San Francisco Art Institute for 5 years. So I was working with artists in a studio context, at a time when the director of the Institute, OPN Resort, was an international curator, was trying to build a global institute of the history and theory of contemporary art. And so we tried to build up the kind of languages of thinking the theory and history of art in a contemporary globalized context. So building a history of art that didn't privilege Western art history, building a set of practices across studio programs and theory, and I co-taught with the artist Alan D'Souza a course called Unruly Subjects, which has a studio component and a theory component, and we were working with artists who were mostly working around representations of sex, gender, race, and thinking about representing the body through their artistic practice. And it's a really exciting opportunity to work with studio artists in an art institute context. I left that position to take up a Canada Research Chair, which is a federally funded research chair at Concordia University in the Department of Communications. And with that chair funding came funding from the Canadian Foundation for Institution to set up a lab. And these are labs for research on campus where space is allotted to you and you have an equipment budget and you can run this lab. And so I created the Feminist Media Studio. It started in 2012 and we renovated the entire space and built up an equipment list that was influenced by three key kind of figures. These are heuristic, but they're figures of feminist media practice. The artist, the independent filmmaker, what's the third one? The activist. And then we built different kits to go with it. So GoPro cameras for the activists, a high-end film camera for the independent filmmaker, and then a Canon D5 for the artist. And the idea was to work across those different modes of production and to think about the ways in which different aesthetic histories, different technologies, and different practices influence how you come to create your work and make meaning. And so the Institute hosts a number of workshops. This was a workshop with the Spanish artist Joan Moll called The Deconstruction of the Internet, which we held at the studio. Workshops and hands-on training. In the spirit of feminist institutions, we have skills potlucks where people bring skills to share with the community. We have presentations of work in progress, the idea of really building community. And presentations, we always have a distinguished lecture. And so part of this is really building capacity for our graduate students who do something that we call in Canada research creation, and that's also called in Britain practice-led research. So students at the master's and PhD level can do a creative project as part of their dissertation at the master's and PhD level. So it's building capacity for making in the spirit of feminist modes of experimentation, and also building a kind of research network with scholars and makers from around the world who've come through the studio and done seminars and workshops. And so we invited the artist Renee Green, who's currently at MIT, the filmmaker Trin Ha, who's at UC Berkeley, the scholar on global icons, Vishen Priyadosh, and others, and they've really come and animated this space and worked with our students. And so that's really what's occupied my time for the last 5 years, and it's been one of the most all-consuming projects that I've been taking care of. And during that time, some ideas have been percolating around my next research project, but I really come here with the kind of seeds of what that project looks like, with the kind of excitement of actually digging into things that I haven't had time to do because I've been institution building. The larger project is called Grounded, Mediating Social Movements. It comes out of a set of insights from my first book about new technologies of vision and the ways in which they represented space. And so I was looking at the representations of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the new practices of embedding recorders with advancing tanks, of soldiers wearing headsets and recording that and then uploading the footage to YouTube. And then artists also trying to create documentaries and experimental things with camera phones, artists in residency in Kabul, creating these performance pieces where Vidéo painted a ruin to create a sculpture of a space that had been totally torn apart. Trying to think about how that was a very different visual regime in many ways than the first Iraq War, which was shock and awe, right? It was the war from above, it was satellite imagery, it was the kind of annihilating image of cameras attached to rockets that as soon as the explosion happened, you lost the vision entirely, right? What was this other mode of recording on the ground, and how was it constituting the ground war, the theater of war, and the space of war in a really different way? Since then, following the social movements of the Arab Spring, of Occupy, of Indignados, of the Printemps Arabe in Montreal, I began to think about, well, how is this movement, this form of visualizing from the ground, how can one theorize it? How can one begin to understand what constitutes this new visual field of social movement that is the space of people taping on the ground? And I think this has become an urgent problem and question in relationship to a lot of the social movements like I Don't Know More, around different forms of settler and decolonizing territorial occupation, around Black Lives Matter, and the uploading of footage of police violence, right? The participatory and grounded nature of new technologies of vision and the use of social media platforms to circulate them and animate publics is clearly a really urgent question for thinking how social movements are constituted in the contemporary moment. And so that's where my research project begins. It's in thinking, what is it that makes media grounded, right? And there are two kind of aspects to this. One is a kind of historical question, and it's to say, and I'll come back to this after, it's to say, actually grounded is not about increasing the immediacy of one's visions of the world. It's not a quantitative shift, it's a qualitative shift. And it's a qualitative shift that actually visualizes according to a series of historical antecedents. In other words, it doesn't emerge out of nowhere. And when people take out camera phones in the street, they have a visual language that they're referring to. And that visual language comes from a history of radical film collectives, of video collectives, of street photography, of experiments in landscape photography, like in topographics. And so, in other words, shooting from the ground isn't just immediate and unmediated. It is historical, and it comes out of a set of practices in radical street photography and media. And so one part of this project is to understand what are the historical antecedents of grounded media. Video collectives would go out into the street and do, like, record interviews spontaneously with people on the street, invite them back to their house and screen it that evening and have a conversation about it. Or they would tape protests in the street and then interview people and then circulate that to further protests. So what are the histories that grounded media in the contemporary moment? What are the aesthetic languages that produce a kind of history of social movement media? Right? What's the relationship between processes of mediation and processes of social organization? And there are, of course, these important instances of filmmakers going into factories and animating workers and intervening in those sort of relationships, going on the street, or in relationship to the top, which is the Black Audio Film Collective in the UK, of really trying to unpack and understand what it means to be Black in Britain in the 1980s, right? And so I want to look at these historical antecedents to move away from a very technophilic and technologically determinist understanding of what new media is like right now. Because people celebrate it's a Twitter revolution, it's circulating on Facebook. These are the determinant tools of the new liberatory movements of revolution in the contemporary moment. And part of me is saying, well, we need to think about the fact that those platforms are corporate structures. They involve a lot of intellectual labor. They have a differential relationship to certain social movements on the ground. And so let's try and think about grounded media as not only a kind of technical phenomenon, but also as a visual language, and a political visual language, when thinking about that. And then the second part of it is to try and say, well, what are the social movements in which questions of ground are particularly important, right? And so one of them, which is something that I was already working on, this is an image from an exhibit I curated in Montreal called World of Matter. It is thinking about movements around resource extraction, where the question of ground is specifically up for contestation. Is this a space that has the permits to allow pipelines to go through, or is this occupied indigenous land, right? The representation of the social space and of the ground in the media makes a huge impact on the ways in which one comes to understand social movements like Standing Rock and Ireland No More in Canada, and understand the different stakeholders in environmental activism and in the regulations of new forms of energy infrastructures. And so that's one of them, is to try and think about how is ground represented in those environmental debates. And the other one is to try and think about the representation of violence against women. And I've been doing work on the artist Teresa Margolles in Mexico, who works a lot with the materials, the detritus of violence in Ciudad Juarez. And so this is a house in Ciudad Juarez which she had dismantled, crushed into rubble, and then rebuilt a wall. And it was recently at the Montreal Musée d'Art Contemporain, and a number of us animated this thing by slowly taking apart the wall, which was this kind of archaeological forensic exercise of pulling out little bits of what was in that house, ceramic wrappers, etc., and uncovering a life there. And it's called La Promesa, so it's the promise, the failed promise of Vidal Juarez, of NAFTA, etc. And then finally, the project which I'm working on, which I proposed for IMéRA and I'm working on here, is to think about the ways in which groundedness constituted the visual culture of the so-called migrant crisis in Europe. How much time do I have?
Well, 5 minutes. Yeah, okay. 5 minutes is fine.
Okay. I already started to work on a project that is uncovering the kind of dominant iconography of reportage of the migrant crisis. And partly this has meant looking at the sea of images and the recursivity of those images, like the young image, the image of the young drowned boy, Elon Kurdi, that moved so quickly through social media circuits that galvanized public sentiment and that in many ways created the event of the crisis out of an ongoing structural problem, right? So thinking about the ways in which icons travel, iconic images travel and become recursive and become affective objects so that people feel a lot about them is one part of that analysis. Another part of the analysis is looking at the ways in which things like the BBC documentary Exodus gave camera phones and SIM cards to migrants crossing from Turkey to Greece and had them record their journey and then created a documentary called Exodus. And so what it means to actually hand off cameras and then record in the midst of a kind of boat that's submerging, right? And what that means was the significance of representing that space of crossing in that way. And then thirdly, looking at new partnerships between new media companies that engage in 3D immersive, either headsets or with your camera where you can move it around and you can see it 360. The partnerships between those companies and humanitarian organizations who have actually created a number of videos and other documents that are actually sort of charity documents that are intended to stimulate charity, either in refugee camps or along the shoreline with all the matte piles of abandoned life vests, right? And so what is immersive technology doing to try and put you there into these particular kinds of sets? The second part of it that I'm working on now is trying to think about the ways in which the art world has so quickly transformed this iconography through a very formal aesthetic language of a kind of epic historical crisis. And so this is Richard Moss's large photographs. They're like this big, and he uses infrared cameras, which are normally used by the military, but to record migrant camps and migrant crossing. Ai Weiwei created a studio on the island of Lesbos and started playing in some ways with the material left by passing migrants on Lesbos. And this is graffiti against documentas taking place in Athens, which was actually in many ways more important than the artworks that happened there. And I'm really interested in this one artwork that had an oath stone that an activist group stole and said, we're not giving you your stone back, basically, as a protest against the kind of institutionalization in art world languages. Alongside this kind of visual analysis, I've been working on building with an artist who is now at NYU, Stony Brook, an artist at Stony Brook and another colleague at UC Santa Barbara, in creating this platform which would house, there would be an anthology, and this would be a platform that would house a series of ancillary documents. One of the things that we wanted to model was the use of activist syllabi. There are lots of like teaching Black Lives Matter or teaching, and so this would be about teaching, in some ways, teaching the migrant crisis and thinking about it. And the way this was created is that it was, the map of Europe is actually only created out of records of cell phone communication. And so the landscape emerges out of a communication infrastructure, and then it was overlaid with liquid. So as you move the cursor, you move through a liquid substance. And then there were these critical analyses of the iconography of the migrant crisis. So it's something I'm still working on, along with the anthology that we're trying to work on this year coming out of an institute that is about critiquing Europe. So we take seriously Thomas Neill's idea that the migrants aren't a crisis for Europe. Europe is a crisis for the migrants, and that's really what animates this anthology. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Krista.